The envelope in my mailbox had that official HOA letterhead that always meant trouble. And this time, they were fining me $2,000 for storing heating oil on my property in what they called an unapproved and dangerous manner. I stood there in my driveway in Wilton, Connecticut, staring at the paper like it might suddenly make sense, but it didn't. My name is Jack Henderson, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Hills development for 3 years without any major problems, until Patricia Brennan became the HOA president 6 months ago. The heating oil tank I installed last November was a brand new 275-gallon above-ground unit that sat in a custom-built enclosure behind my garage. I had done everything by the book because I worked as a civil engineer and knew better than to cut corners on something involving fuel storage. The enclosure had proper ventilation, fire-resistant walls, a containment basin that could hold 1.5 times the tank capacity, and more safety features than most gas stations in the area. My house was one of the older properties in the development, built in the 1970s before natural gas lines reached this part of Wilton, and heating oil was standard back then. I walked back into my house and called my neighbor Tom Reynolds, who had warned me that Patricia was on a warpath lately. Tom answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said. "You got a letter from our favorite person. $2,000 fine for my heating oil tank. Tom, this is insane. Everything is up to code. I have permits from the town." Permits don't matter to Patricia. She thinks she runs a kingdom here, not a neighborhood. Did you see what she did to the Martins last month? Fined them for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. 12 hours, Jack. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. What do I do here? Fight it. Request a hearing. But I'm warning you, she's packed the board with her friends. Linda Hutchinson and Karen Mueller will vote however Patricia tells them to. Karen Mueller. Of course there was a Karen involved in this mess. I had met her exactly twice, and both times she had complained about something. First about kids riding bikes too fast through the neighborhood, then about someone's lawn being a 1/4 inch too long according to the HOA bylaws. I spent the next hour reading through my copy of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The document was 73 pages of small print, and I had signed it when I bought the house without reading every word, which I now regretted. I found the section about storage of flammable materials. It stated that such materials must be stored in accordance with all local, state, and federal regulations, and in a manner that does not present a hazard to neighboring properties. That was it. Nothing about requiring special HOA approval. Nothing about above-ground versus underground tanks. I had followed every regulation, obtained every permit, and my setup was safer than most. I grabbed my phone and called the Wilton Fire Marshal's office. The receptionist transferred me to Fire Marshal David Chen, who had actually inspected my tank setup back in November during installation. "Mr. Henderson, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "Marshal Chen, I'm having an issue with my HOA. They're claiming my heating oil storage is dangerous and fining me $2,000. I was hoping you might have some documentation from your inspection that I could present to them." "Your setup." "That's one of the cleanest residential oil storage installations I've seen in my 15 years doing this job. Hold on, let me pull up my notes." I heard keyboard clicking. "Yeah, here it is. You exceeded code requirements in multiple areas. The containment system, the ventilation, the fire suppression equipment. You even installed that automatic shut-off valve that isn't required for residential applications. Who at the HOA is claiming this is dangerous?" "The president, Patricia Brennan." "Brennan. That name sounds familiar." More typing. "Oh, right. She lives at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. That's her address, yes. Mr. Henderson, this is interesting. We inspected her property last year after a neighbor complaint. She has an old underground heating oil tank from the 1980s that's past its recommended lifespan. We issued her a notice recommending replacement within 2 years. Those old underground tanks are exactly the kind that leak and cause environmental contamination. I can send you a copy of my inspection report on your property, and I'd be happy to attend any HOA hearing to provide expert testimony if needed. I felt a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. I would really appreciate that, Marshal Chen. Let me know when works for you, and I'll make sure it aligns with the hearing date. After hanging up, I immediately sent an email to the HOA board requesting a formal hearing to contest the fine. The CC and Articus stated I had 30 days from the date of the notice to request such a hearing, and the board had to schedule it within 21 days of my request. Patricia responded within an hour, which surprised me. Her email was curt and formal, informing me that a hearing would be scheduled for 2 weeks from today at the community clubhouse at 7 in the evening. She also reminded me that failure to pay the fine would result in additional penalties and potential legal action, including a lien on my property. I forwarded the email to my lawyer friend Mike Stevens, who practiced real estate law in Stamford. Mike and I had gone to college together at the University of Connecticut, and he had helped me with the closing when I bought my house. Mike called me back that evening. "Jack, this is pretty straightforward. They can't fine you for something that's legal and permitted by the municipality. HOAs have authority over aesthetic issues and things explicitly covered in the CC and Articus, but they can't override local building codes and fire safety regulations. Bring all your documentation to the hearing. The permits, the inspection reports, everything. And definitely bring the fire marshal if he's willing to attend. What if they vote to uphold the fine anyway? Then we file a complaint in Superior Court and get an injunction. It'll cost you some legal fees, but you'll win. More importantly, if we can show that the HOA board acted unreasonably or in bad faith, we might be able to recover your attorney's fees from the HOA. That means from the collective funds that all homeowners pay into, which tends to make people unhappy with board members who waste money on unwinnable fights." The next 2 weeks crawled by. I gathered every piece of documentation related to my heating oil tank installation. The original quotes from 3 different companies, the final contract with Murphy's Oil and Heating out of Norwalk, the town building permit, the fire marshal's inspection report with his glowing comments, photographs of the installation from every angle, the manufacturer's specifications for the tank showing it met all industry standards. I even got a letter from my insurance company confirming that my homeowner's policy covered the installation without any additional premium because it met all safety requirements. I also did some research on Patricia Brennan. According to property records, she had bought her house in 1987, making her one of the oldest residents in Meadowbrook Hills. She had been on the HOA board in various capacities for 12 years and became president after the previous president, a mild-mannered accountant named Roger Pierce, resigned to spend more time with his new grandchildren. Tom Reynolds filled me in on the rest over beers at a local bar called the Rusty Nail. Patricia retired from her job as a middle school administrator about 2 years ago, Tom explained, nursing a Sam Adams. Ever since then, she's needed something to control, and the HOA became her new school. She treats homeowners like misbehaving students. Karen Mueller is her longtime friend, bought a house here about 5 years ago specifically to be near Patricia. And Linda Hutchinson is just someone who likes being part of the in crowd. Those three vote as a block on everything. What about the other board members? I thought there were 5 seats. There are. David Armstrong is the treasurer, and he's pretty reasonable, actually. Former accountant, very by the books. He's voted against Patricia a few times, which drives her crazy. The 5th seat has been vacant since January when Paul Morrison moved to Florida. Patricia keeps delaying the election to fill it. Convenient. Very. With only 4 active members, she just needs Karen and Linda to get a majority. David gets outvoted 3-1 on anything he opposes. The night before the hearing, I stayed up late reviewing my presentation. Marshal Chen had confirmed he would attend and provide testimony. Mike Stevens would also be there, though not in an official capacity unless things went really wrong. I had prepared a 15-minute presentation laying out all the facts, with photos and documentation ready to pass around to the board members. I barely slept. At 6:30 the next morning, I was already awake, watching the sunrise through my bedroom window. The hearing wasn't until 7 in the evening, so I had all day to be anxious. I went to work at my engineering firm in Stamford, but couldn't focus on the bridge design project I was supposed to be finishing. My boss, Frank Morrison, noticed me staring at my computer screen without actually doing anything. "Everything okay, Jack?" I explained the HOA situation. Frank, who lived in a neighborhood without an HOA, shook his head. "This is exactly why I refuse to buy in any development with one of those. They start out with reasonable intentions, maintaining property values and common areas, but they always seem to attract petty tyrants who get drunk on the tiniest bit of power." That's a perfect description of Patricia Brennan. Well, you've got the facts on your side. That matters in the end, even if it takes some time and frustration to get there. I left work at 5, went home to shower and change into business casual clothes, then gathered all my materials into a leather portfolio. At 6:45, I drove the half-mile to the Meadowbrook Hills clubhouse. It was a modest building with a large multi-purpose room, a small kitchen, and bathrooms. The HOA used it for monthly meetings and residents could rent it for parties. I arrived to find about 15 people already there, which surprised me. Normally, HOA meetings drew maybe 5 or 6 residents total. Tom Reynolds waved me over to some seats he had saved in the front row. Marshal Chen arrived a few minutes later in uniform and took a seat beside me. Mike Stevens came in right at 7 and stood in the back, giving me a subtle thumbs up. Patricia Brennan sat at a folding table at the front of the room with Karen Mueller and Linda Hutchinson on either side of her. David Armstrong sat at the end, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Patricia was exactly what you'd picture for a former school administrator on a power trip. Late 50s, helmet of highlighted hair that hadn't changed style since 1995, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and a permanent expression of disapproval. Karen Mueller looked like Patricia's slightly younger twin, same haircut, similar fashion sense, with the addition of a visible air of entitlement. Linda Hutchinson was different, younger, maybe early 40s, dressed more casually, and she kept glancing at the growing crowd with what looked like nervousness. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7:05. "We have one item on the agenda tonight. The appeal by Jack Henderson of 423 Willow Creek Road regarding a fine levied for violation of HOA regulations concerning storage of flammable materials. Mr. Henderson, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood up and moved to a spot where everyone could see me. "Thank you. I'll try to be concise. Last November, I installed a new heating oil storage tank at my property. My house was built in 1974 and has always used heating oil for heat. The old underground tank was reaching the end of its recommended lifespan, so I replaced it with a modern above-ground unit. I pulled out the first set of photos, passing copies to the board members and holding up an enlarged version for the audience. As you can see, the tank is housed in a purpose-built enclosure behind my garage. This enclosure exceeds all state and local requirements. It has fire-resistant walls rated for 2 hours, which is double the residential requirement. The containment basin can hold 412 gallons, which is 1.5 times the tank capacity, exceeding the requirement of 110% capacity. Patricia interrupted. Mr. Henderson, the issue isn't whether you followed some government regulations. The issue is that you installed this without HOA approval, and it presents a danger to your neighbors. With respect, I followed every regulation that applies to my property. The CC and Articus don't require HOA approval for heating systems. Section 7, Paragraph 3 states that storage of flammable materials must be done in accordance with all regulations, and in a manner that doesn't present a hazard. I've done exactly that. Karen Mueller leaned forward. You have hundreds of gallons of explosive fuel right in your backyard. How is that not a hazard? Fire Marshal Chen stood up. May I address that question? Patricia looked annoyed. And you are David Chen, Wilton Fire Marshal. I conducted the inspection and approval of Mr. Henderson's installation last November. I'm here to provide expert testimony. Patricia's expression soured further, but she nodded. Fine, go ahead. Marshal Chen moved to stand beside me. First, heating oil is not explosive. It has a flash point of 140 degrees Fahrenheit and is classified as a combustible liquid, not a flammable one. It's actually quite difficult to ignite compared to gasoline or natural gas. Second, Mr. Henderson's installation is one of the safest residential fuel storage systems I've inspected in my 15 years as fire marshal. The containment system, fire suppression, automatic shutoff valves, and ventilation all exceed code requirements. He pulled out his own folder. I brought copies of my inspection report for the board. You'll see I noted several areas where Mr. Henderson voluntarily exceeded minimum requirements. In my professional opinion, this installation presents less risk than many of the underground oil tanks still in use throughout this neighborhood, including some that are 40 or 50 years old and well past their recommended replacement date. Patricia's face flushed red. Are you suggesting my concerns aren't valid? I'm stating a professional fact. Mr. Henderson's installation is safe, legal, and exceeds all applicable standards. We have the right to maintain standards in this community that go beyond minimum government requirements. Marshal Chen's expression hardened slightly. Not when it comes to fire safety, you don't. If you attempted to require removal or modification of a compliant permitted installation, you'd be overstepping your authority. Furthermore, if you had any actual safety concerns, you should have contacted my office or the building department, not issued a fine. An older man in the audience raised his hand. I have a question for the fire marshal. Patricia looked like she wanted to say no, but too many people were watching. Go ahead. You mentioned old underground tanks being a concern. How many are still in this neighborhood? I'd estimate at least 30 to 40 houses in Meadowbrook Hills still have underground oil tanks. Most from the 1970s and 1980s. They have a typical lifespan of 20 to 30 years. Many are now at risk of leaking, which can cause soil contamination and groundwater pollution. We encourage homeowners to replace them with modern above-ground units like Mr. Henderson installed. Another resident called out, "Does Patricia Brennan have one of those old tanks?" Marshal Chen paused, clearly not wanting to turn this into a personal attack, but committed to facts. I can't discuss individual properties without permission, but I will say that we inspected the property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive last year and found an underground tank from 1984 that we recommended for replacement within 2 years. The murmuring in the audience grew louder. Patricia banged her hand on the table. That's completely irrelevant to this hearing. Actually, it's very relevant, I said, my patience wearing thin. You're fining me for having an installation that the fire marshal says exceeds safety standards, while you yourself have an aging underground tank that poses an actual environmental risk. This isn't about safety at all, is it? How dare you? Patricia snapped. I've been a responsible homeowner in this community for 38 years, and I'm trying to be one too by upgrading to a safer heating system. David Armstrong cleared his throat. Patricia, I have to say, I'm not seeing grounds for this fine. The installation is permitted and approved by the fire marshal. The CC and Articus don't prohibit it. I don't see how we can justify a $2,000 penalty. Linda Hutchinson nodded slowly. I agree with David. I thought this was going to be about an actual safety issue, but it sounds like Jack did everything right. Karen Mueller looked at Patricia, then at the audience, clearly calculating her position. The fine might be excessive, but we should at least require some kind of additional screening or landscaping to hide the enclosure from view. I pulled out more photos. The enclosure is already screened by existing vegetation and the garage structure. You can't see it from the street or from any neighboring property. I have photos from multiple angles showing this. Patricia was cornered and she knew it. We'll take this under advisement and vote. The CC and Articus require an immediate vote at the conclusion of a hearing, David Armstrong said quietly. Section 12, paragraph 7. Patricia glared at him but pulled out her copy of the bylaws. After a moment she looked up. Fine, we'll vote now. All in favor of upholding the fine. Only Karen Mueller raised her hand, and even she did it half-heartedly. Opposed? David Armstrong and Linda Hutchinson raised their hands. The fine is overturned, David said. Mr. Henderson, you owe nothing. The HOA will send you written confirmation within 5 business days. Patricia looked like she had bitten into a lemon. This meeting is adjourned. I gathered my materials, thanked Marshal Chen, and walked out with Tom Reynolds and several other neighbors who wanted to congratulate me. Mike Stevens caught up with me in the parking lot. That went well. Better than I expected, actually. Thanks for being here. I felt better knowing you were in the room. Patricia is going to be out for blood now. You embarrassed her in front of the community. She embarrassed herself. I just defended my property rights. Mike nodded but looked concerned. Watch your back. People like her don't let things go. He was right. Over the next 2 months, I received 3 more violation notices from the HOA. First, for my lawn being unevenly maintained, even though I had it professionally mowed every week. I took dated photos showing the lawn met all specifications, and the notice was quietly withdrawn. Second, for unauthorized exterior modifications, because I had replaced my mailbox. The old one had been falling apart, and I had replaced it with an identical model in the same location. I provided receipts and photos showing it matched the HOA's approved styles, and that notice was also withdrawn. Third, for creating a nuisance by having construction debris visible from the street. This one was complete fiction. I had no construction debris. I took photos showing my entire property was clean. Got statements from 3 neighbors confirming there was no debris, and sent it all to the board with a letter from Mike Stevens warning that continued harassment could result in legal action. David Armstrong called me after that. Jack, I want to apologize for what's happening. Patricia is using her position to retaliate against you, and it's not right. I've been documenting everything. I appreciate that, David. This is getting ridiculous. It's worse than you know. She's been trying to get the board to pass new rules that would effectively ban above-ground heating oil tanks, even though that would probably be illegal and would hurt property values for the 30-plus houses that use heating oil. I've been voting against her on everything, but it's exhausting. What about Linda Hutchinson? She seemed reasonable at the hearing. Linda is uncomfortable with all this, but she's conflict-averse. She'll vote with Patricia if it's not something too egregious. Karen, of course, is Patricia's lapdog and votes however she's told. A week later, Tom Reynolds called me with news. You're not going to believe this. Patricia is trying to do an emergency special assessment on all homeowners to fund a lawsuit against you. A lawsuit for what? She's claiming you damaged the HOA's credibility and authority by challenging the fine, and she wants the HOA to sue you for reimbursement of some made-up costs. She's calling for a special meeting next week. Can she do that? She can call for a vote on it, but it needs approval from a majority of all homeowners, not just the board. There are 142 houses in Meadowbrook Hills, so she'd need 72 votes. I called Mike Stevens again. It's time to go on offense. This is harassment, and she's now trying to misuse HOA funds for a personal vendetta. What are my options? Mike thought for a moment. A few things. First, you can file a complaint with the Connecticut Fair Housing Department if you think you're being discriminated against. Second, you can sue the HOA and Patricia personally for harassment. Third, and this might be most effective, you can petition for a recall election to remove her from the board. How does a recall work? According to most HOA bylaws in Connecticut, 20% of homeowners can petition for a recall vote on any board member. That would be about 28 or 29 homeowners in your development. If you get the signatures, there has to be a special election within 30 days. A simple majority of votes cast can remove a board member. Let's do it. I spent the next week talking to neighbors. It turned out a lot of people were fed up with Patricia's increasingly authoritarian approach to running the HOA. The Martins, who had been fined over their trash cans, eagerly signed. So did the Kowalskis, who had been cited for having the wrong shade of white paint on their fence. The Patels signed after telling me about a warning they received for decorative lights during Diwali that allegedly violated the excessive exterior lighting rules. Tom Reynolds and I divided up the neighborhood and went door to door. We explained what Patricia was trying to do with the special assessment and lawsuit, and we emphasized that this was about preventing the HOA from being run as a personal fiefdom. Within a week, we had 47 signatures, well over the required 20%. I submitted the petition to David Armstrong, who was required by the bylaws to verify the signatures and schedule the election. David called me that evening, and he sounded both relieved and worried. The petition is valid. I have to schedule the recall election within 30 days. But Jack, Patricia is going ballistic. She's threatening to sue me personally for allowing this to proceed. She has no grounds for that. You're following the bylaws. I know, but she's not thinking rationally anymore. This has become personal for her. She's convinced she's protecting the neighborhood from chaos, and you're the face of that chaos in her mind. The recall election was scheduled for 4 weeks out, with absentee ballots available for anyone who couldn't attend in person. Patricia immediately launched a campaign to save her position. She sent multiple emails to all homeowners, framing the recall as an attempt by rule breakers and malcontents to undermine the HOA's ability to maintain property values. Karen Mueller went door to door. telling people that removing Patricia would lead to the neighborhood falling into disrepair. She painted a picture of overgrown lawns, houses in disrepair, and plummeting property values if Patricia wasn't there to enforce standards. I stayed measured in my response. Tom and I prepared a simple fact sheet laying out the actual issues. Patricia's retaliatory fines against homeowners who disagreed with her, her attempt to use HOA funds for a personal lawsuit, her rejection of expert testimony from the fire marshal, and her general pattern of increasingly strict enforcement that went beyond what the CC and Artiques actually required. We didn't have to work that hard, honestly. Patricia's own actions did most of the campaigning for us. 2 weeks before the election, she sent an email threatening fines against anyone who displayed yard signs supporting the recall, claiming they violated rules about political signage. David Armstrong sent a reply all email pointing out that HOA elections weren't political in nature, and the signage rules didn't apply. Patricia then tried to cancel the election entirely, claiming procedural irregularities with the petition. David and I both received certified letters from an attorney Patricia had hired personally, demanding that the election be postponed pending a review. Mike Stevens drafted a response explaining that the bylaws were clear, the petition was valid, and any attempt to cancel or postpone the lawfully scheduled election would itself be grounds for legal action. He sent copies not just to Patricia's attorney, but to every board member and posted it on the community Facebook page that several residents maintained. The election took place on a Thursday evening in late August. The clubhouse was packed with over 100 residents, the largest turnout anyone could remember. Absentee ballots had been flooding in all week. David Armstrong, as treasurer and the only board member not aligned with Patricia, oversaw the process. Patricia made a final speech before voting began, her voice tight with emotion. "I have dedicated 12 years to this community. I have worked tirelessly to maintain the standards that make Meadowbrook Hills a desirable place to live. This recall is being driven by one man who refused to follow simple safety rules and who has convinced others to join his crusade against order and responsibility. I ask you to vote no on this recall and allow me to continue serving this community." I gave a brief statement in response. "This isn't about me. This is about how the HOA should function. Should it be a tool for enforcing reasonable standards that we all agreed to, or should it be a weapon for personal vendettas? Should board members listen to expert testimony from fire safety professionals, or should they ignore facts in favor of their own assumptions? Should homeowners be fined for imaginary violations as retaliation for challenging board decisions? The answer to all those questions should be obvious. I'm asking you to vote yes on the recall so we can return to reasonable governance." The voting took an hour. David and 2 neutral volunteers counted the ballots in a back room while everyone waited. The tension in the main room was thick enough to cut. Patricia sat with Karen Mueller and Linda Hutchinson at their table, stone-faced. I sat with Tom and several other neighbors, trying not to watch the clock. Finally, David emerged with the results. Total eligible voters, 142. Total votes cast, including absentee ballots, 118. Votes needed for recall, 59. Votes in favor of recall, 87. Votes against recall, 31. The recall has passed. Patricia Brennan is removed from the board effective immediately. The room erupted in applause from about 2/3 of the people there. Patricia stood up, her face pale, grabbed her papers and walked out without a word. Karen Mueller followed her. Linda Hutchinson stayed seated, looking relieved more than anything. David called a brief board meeting right there to establish temporary leadership, until a proper election could be held. With only 3 board members now remaining, David became interim president by a 2-to-1 vote, with only Karen voting against. Over the next few months, things in Meadowbrook Hills settled into a new normal. David appointed Tom Reynolds to fill the vacant 5th board seat temporarily. They scheduled a proper election for November, and 4 reasonable candidates stepped forward, including 2 younger homeowners who had never been involved before. Patricia became a recluse in the neighborhood. Her house went on the market in October, and according to Tom, she was moving to South Carolina to be near her daughter. Karen Mueller stayed, but stopped coming to HOA meetings or events. In December, I received a certified letter from Murphy's Oil and Heating informing me that the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection had contacted them regarding a complaint about my heating oil installation. I called the Deep office and spoke with an inspector named Sarah Martinez. "Mr. Henderson, we received an anonymous complaint claiming you had an unpermitted and unsafe heating oil storage system. I checked with the Wilton Building Department and Fire Marshal, and both confirmed your installation is properly permitted and exceeds all safety requirements. I'm closing this complaint as unfounded, but I wanted to give you a courtesy call since this appears to be harassment." "It absolutely is." "Can you tell me anything about who filed the complaint?" "Officially, it was anonymous, but the letter was postmarked from Hilton Head, South Carolina. Does that mean anything to you?" I laughed. "Yeah, it means Patricia Brennan is still holding a grudge even after moving to another state." "Well, there's nothing here to investigate. Your setup is excellent, but if you receive any more complaints or issues from this person, you might want to consider a restraining order for harassment." I mentioned this to Mike Stevens, who agreed it had probably been Patricia. "The good news is she's far away, and she doesn't have any actual power anymore. The bad news is she's clearly obsessive about this. Keep documentation of any further contact or complaints she generates." In January, I received a demand letter from Patricia's attorney claiming I owed her $3,500 for damage to reputation and mental distress caused by the recall campaign. Mike responded with a letter pointing out that the recall was conducted in full compliance with HOA bylaws, that Patricia's removal was the result of her own actions, and that any further frivolous legal demands would result in counterclaims for harassment. We never heard from Patricia's attorney again. The new HOA board, elected in November, took a completely different approach. David Armstrong remained as president. The new members included Tom Reynolds, a retired teacher named Margaret Sullivan, a software engineer named Ahmed Hassan, and a nurse named Christine Porter. Their first act was to review all fines and violations issued in the previous year. They found a pattern of increasingly petty and retaliatory enforcement under Patricia's leadership. They rescinded 17 questionable fines that had been issued to various homeowners and sent apology letters. They also revised the violation procedure to require photographic evidence, a warning period before any fine could be issued, and an automatic appeal process. In February, something interesting happened. The Wilton Fire Marshal's office conducted a neighborhood-wide inspection campaign, offering free assessments of underground heating oil tanks. Marshal Chen personally came by my house to thank me. "Your case brought attention to an issue we'd been trying to address for years," he explained. "We've now inspected 43 properties in Meadowbrook Hills. 17 had underground tanks that were past their lifespan and showed signs of deterioration. 6 had minor leaks that would have become major environmental problems. We've been working with homeowners to get them upgraded." "What about Patricia's house? It sold a few months ago. The buyers hired us to inspect before closing. The underground tank had a slow leak. The sale was delayed 3 weeks while they did emergency remediation and installed a new above-ground system. Cost about $12,000, which the seller had to cover. If Patricia had just replaced it when we recommended, it would have cost maybe $4,000. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had fought so hard against my safe, compliant installation while ignoring the actual hazard on her own property, and it ended up costing her dearly. By spring, life in Meadowbrook Hills was genuinely pleasant. The new board focused on actual community improvement, organizing neighborhood events, maintaining common areas, and enforcing rules reasonably and consistently. People started attending HOA meetings not because they were afraid of being targeted, but because they actually wanted to participate. I installed a small patio behind my house in March, properly permitted and within all setback requirements. I half expected some complaint or issue, but instead, Ahmed Hassan from the board stopped by to compliment the stonework and ask who I had hired for the job. Tom Reynolds and I were having a beer on that new patio one Saturday afternoon in April when he brought up the whole saga. "You know, Jack, you could have just paid the $2,000 fine. It would have been easier." Easier isn't always better. Patricia was abusing her authority and someone needed to stand up to it. If I had just paid, she would have kept doing the same thing to other people. You're right. But still, you took on a lot of stress for a principal. I took a sip of my beer and looked at my heating oil enclosure, barely visible behind some shrubs. It was never really about the oil tank, you know. It was about whether one person gets to make up rules and punish people for not following them, even when those rules don't actually exist. That kind of thing spreads if you don't stop it. Philosophical Jack, who knew? Tom grinned. But seriously, the neighborhood is better now. People actually like living here again. Margaret Sullivan told me she was planning to move because Patricia's HOA was making her miserable, but now she's happy to stay. The following month, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Karen Mueller, Patricia's former ally on the board. It was handwritten, not typed, and relatively short. "Dear Jack, I owe you an apology. I supported Patricia in her campaign against you because she was my friend and I trusted her judgment. After she moved and I had time to reflect, I realized that she had become obsessed with control, and I went along with it because it was easier than confronting her. Your heating oil tank was never a real safety issue, and I should have been honest about that. I'm sorry for the stress we put you through. I hope you can accept this apology even if we never become friends. Sincerely, Karen Mueller." I showed the letter to my girlfriend Nina Thompson, who I had started dating in December. She read it carefully and handed it back. "That takes guts to write," Nina said. "Are you going to respond?" "I think so. I'm not angry at Karen, not really. She was following Patricia's lead. Taking responsibility after the fact means something." I wrote a brief response thanking her for the apology and saying there were no hard feelings. Life was too short for grudges, especially over something that was ultimately resolved. In June, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection gave Wilton a commendation for the heating oil tank inspection program that had been sparked by my case. Marshal Chen invited me to the small ceremony at Town Hall. The program had identified and helped remediate 23 leaking or failing underground tanks across Wilton, preventing what could have been significant environmental contamination. The Wilton Bulletin ran a story about the program, and while my name wasn't mentioned directly, the article noted that the initiative began after a homeowner's proactive upgrade to a modern heating system brought attention to the issue. I kept a copy of the article, not because I needed recognition, but because it was a reminder that standing up for what's right can have ripple effects you don't anticipate. The following August, exactly a year after the recall election, the HOA held a neighborhood barbecue at the clubhouse. Over 80 people attended, including families with kids running around the playground and seniors sitting in lawn chairs catching up with neighbors. David Armstrong gave a brief speech thanking everyone for helping restore the community spirit. A year ago, we were a neighborhood divided by petty disputes and excessive enforcement, David said. Today, we're a community that works together to maintain our properties and support each other. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because people were willing to stand up for reasonable governance, and because we all decided that cooperation works better than conflict. People clapped, and several glanced my way. I wasn't looking for credit, but I appreciated the acknowledgement that sometimes you have to fight the small battles to win the larger war for common sense. As summer turned to fall, I found myself genuinely enjoying life in Meadowbrook Hills. My house was comfortable, my heating system worked perfectly, and I had good neighbors who looked out for each other. Nina had moved in with me in September, and we were talking about marriage. One October evening, I was checking my mail when I noticed a letter from the law firm that had represented Patricia during the recall. My stomach tightened for a moment, but when I opened it, I found something unexpected. It was a formal notice that Patricia Brennan was dropping all claims related to the recall and the heating oil dispute. The letter stated that she acknowledged the recall was conducted properly, and that she had no legal basis for any claims against me or the HOA. It was signed by her attorney with a note at the bottom. Client has instructed us to close all matters related to Meadowbrook Hills HOA and wishes to move forward with her life in South Carolina. I showed the letter to Nina. I guess she finally let it go. About time. That woman spent over a year being angry about something that was her own fault. Some people can't admit when they're wrong. It eats them up from the inside. We never heard from Patricia Brennan again. Life moved on as it does. David Armstrong served as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down to focus on his grandchildren. Tom Reynolds took over and did an excellent job. The board remained reasonable and focused on actual community needs rather than manufactured crises. My heating oil tank continued to function perfectly, requiring only routine maintenance. Every fall, I scheduled my delivery from Murphy's Oil and Heating, and every year the driver would comment on what a clean and professional setup I had. 3 years after the whole saga began, I was at a continuing education seminar for civil engineers in Hartford when I ran into Fire Marshal Chen. He had been promoted to deputy fire chief for the region. "Jack Henderson, how's life in Meadowbrook Hills?" "Quiet and pleasant, exactly how it should be. Congratulations on the promotion." "Thanks. You know, I still use photos of your heating oil installation in training sessions for new inspectors. It's a perfect example of how residential fuel storage should be done." "I'm honored, I think." Chen laughed. "You should be." That whole situation turned into a case study in multiple ways. Fire safety, HOA governance, standing up for reasonable regulation. I've probably told that story 100 times. Just glad I could contribute to education, even if it wasn't the plan. Looking back on everything, I realized the situation had taught me several important lessons. First, doing things the right way and having documentation matters. If I hadn't obtained proper permits, hired licensed contractors, and kept detailed records, Patricia might have won her crusade against me. Second, standing up to unreasonable authority is important, even when it's stressful and time-consuming. If no one challenges abuse of power, it only gets worse. Third, most people are reasonable and will support you if you're in the right, but you have to give them the information and opportunity to do so. The recall campaign succeeded not because I convinced everyone that Patricia was terrible, but because I showed them a pattern of unreasonable behavior backed up with facts. People don't like bullies, especially when the bully is supposed to be serving the community. Nina and I got married in May of the 4th year, in a ceremony at the Meadowbrook Hills clubhouse. It felt fitting somehow, celebrating our new beginning in the place where I had fought for reasonable governance. Over half the neighborhood attended, and even Linda Hutchinson came, bringing a lovely wedding gift and congratulating us warmly. During the reception, Tom Reynolds gave a toast that made everyone laugh. To Jack and Nina, and to Jack's famous heating oil tank, which brought this community together in ways no one expected. May your marriage be as solid as Jack's containment basin, and may you never have to deal with another Patricia Brennan. Everyone cheered and drank to that. As the evening wound down and Nina and I danced under string lights in the clubhouse, I thought about how strange life could be. A simple home improvement project, done properly and safely, had somehow turned into a year-long battle that transformed an entire neighborhood. If someone had told me when I first bought my house that replacing my heating oil tank would lead to all of this, I never would have believed them, but I wouldn't change any of it. My house was safer and more efficient. My neighborhood was better governed and more united. I had met good people and made lasting friendships. And I had learned that sometimes the smallest stands on principle can have the biggest impacts. The heating oil tank that started everything continued to sit in its enclosure behind my garage, quietly and safely providing heat to my house every winter. It never leaked, never caused any problems, and never gave anyone any legitimate reason for concern. It was exactly what I had intended it to be from the beginning. A responsible upgrade that made my home better while following every rule and regulation. And if some petty tyrant with a vendetta couldn't accept that, well, that was her problem, not mine. I had done everything right, and in the end that mattered. The fire marshal confirmed it. The town confirmed it. The HOA board eventually confirmed it. And most importantly, my neighbors confirmed it by voting to restore reasonable governance to our community. Years later, when new neighbors would move into Meadowbrook Hills, someone would inevitably tell them the story of the great heating oil tank controversy. It became part of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach, and a success story about community members standing up for common sense. I never sought to be the protagonist of that story, but I didn't shy away from it either. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting conflict and seeing it through to a just conclusion. Sometimes it means gathering evidence, getting expert testimony, and methodically proving your case. And sometimes it means having the courage to trust that your neighbors will recognize the truth when it's presented to them clearly. The last I heard, Patricia Brennan was living quietly in South Carolina, serving on the board of her new homeowners association there. I hoped she had learned something from the Meadowbrook Hills experience, but I suspected she probably hadn't. Some people never learn. They just move on to the next place where they can try to control things until someone stops them. But that was no longer my problem or my concern. I had my life, my home, my wife, and my community. My heating oil tank continued to operate safely and efficiently, exceeding every standard and proving every single day that I had been right all along. And really, that was all that mattered in the end.